Hello, friends. Today I'm going to be talking about probably two of my favorite topics, and that is Bob Dylan and Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, I know I've been talking a lot about Friedrich Nietzsche just the past few videos. I just am kind of eternally interested in Nietzsche as a figure. So, yeah, and I'm talking about him again because Bob Dylan, as some of you may know, is my favorite artist ever. I love Bob Dylan, and I only recently somehow kind of put the pieces together as to the connection between Dylan and Nietzsche, and I think it's a very fascinating one, because I think that there's an argument to be made, an argument that I'll make in this video, that Dylan is a very Nietzschean figure. So that's the argument I'm going to make. I understand this is kind of a niche video, only for Dylan and Nietzsche fans, but hopefully, if you're just a fan of Nietzsche, you'll take something out of this. If you're just a fan of Dylan, this will just be interesting to you. I don't know, so I hope you stick around. Anyways, let's jump into it. First of all, one of the most well-known aspects of Dylan as a person is his resistance to any sort of press, any sort of interviews, right? He's a very elusive person, and this is kind of a defining feature of his character. I mean, there's famous clips all over the internet from the 1960s, especially at the height of his powers, you could say. And that's mostly the Dylan I'm going to be talking about today. That Bob Dylan was, he would constantly mess with the press. More than just in not answering questions, but in just saying blatant lies, things that make no sense at all.
Stick with folk rock, or are you going on into more writing?
I don't play folk rock.
What would you call your music?
I would call it, I like to think of it more in terms of vision music. It's mathematical music.
I really find this interesting because it parallels a idea within Nietzsche, and that is this sort of rejection of truth. And that's something that Bob Dylan takes very much to heart in his artistic expression as well, because he constantly wants to resist any sort of specific interpretation of his work. People ask him, what does this mean? What do you stand for? What position are you on? And he never answers that, and he never wants to make it seem as though his songs have any message. He famously said that he doesn't have some great message to put out there, right? And along with the lying and all of that, he is very actively rejecting any attachment to truth that people want to come to about his own work. And I find this very fascinating. Nietzsche says in the opening of Beyond Good and Evil, he says, granted we want truth, why not rather untruth? And Bob Dylan says in his book, Chronicles, if you told the truth, that was all well and good. But if you told the untruth, well, that's still well and good. So you can definitely see the parallels here. Bob Dylan does not care about the truth when it comes to his artistic expression. Or I guess you could say he cares about his own type of truth. And that's very much in line with something that Nietzsche was trying to do. And you see this, again, in a lot of his songs, which sometimes all seem to contradict each other, sometimes seem very intentionally not easy to understand on any level, and full of lies. I think where I would go initially is like something like the Ballad of Hollis Brown, where he's telling this very intimate story about this character who lived through the Dust Bowl. But of course, Bob Dylan never lived through the Dust Bowl. Bob Dylan had no idea what it was like to do this. And so the story, the sort of persona that he's putting on as this sort of rough character in this song is very much a lie. That's sort of the inkling of where he would start with that sort of type of writing. But where he really peaked at this type of writing was obviously in his electric era with Bringing It All Back Home and Highway 61, Blonde on Blonde, right? I think, again, the songs that come to mind here are something like It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding, where he says, I mean, you could probably pick any lines in that song because the entire song is very abstract and strange, and you could say very resisting of any concrete meaning that you would want to attach to it. The first section of lines that I like is when he says, quote, "Temptation's page flies out the door, you follow, find yourself at war, watch waterfalls of pity roar, you feel to moan, but unlike before, you discover that you'd just be one more person crying." You can give me your interpretation of that. I very much like how he's dealing with this idea of pity, which is also something that Nietzsche deals with, and kind of confronting a nihilism, which he also confronts in the second section of lines that I like, where he says, "Disillusioned words like bullet spark, as human gods aim for their mark, can make everything from a toy guns that spark to flesh-colored Christs that glow in the dark. It's easy to see without looking too far that not much is really sacred." So he's very much confronting the established sort of morals and values of his modern society. I think he does that in a lot of his songs, but especially in this song. And again, that's something that Nietzsche was very much doing with his work. And in a very similar vein as this, in a way that is not just, here's my criticism, but is much more abstract, much more resisting of that truth, right? And again, Desolation Row, I think, confronts this very same disillusionment that Dylan has with society, as all the characters in the song Desolation Row are all feeling very disillusioned with the very absurd situations that are going on in their society. And Desolation Row is sort of a metaphor in that aspect for that disillusionment. At least, again, that's how I interpret the song. I think it's very easy to interpret these songs in a lot of different ways, and that's very intentional, I think, on Dylan's part. Something that Nietzsche says is that there are no facts, only interpretations, right? And so it's very much in the eye of the beholder when we're reading something. I think that's part of the main reason why Dylan doesn't want to say, oh, this is my message, this is what I'm saying. And he wants to resist that as much as he possibly can when the press or whoever is asking him about what his songs are about. Maybe he does have a message, but I think what he understands is that the real truth of his work is gathered by whoever it may be that is listening to it. He is not the arbiter of the truth that his words have, right? Now, another thing that I think you could also parallel between Dylan and Nietzsche is they both have a sense of humor, I guess. And that's not, lots of people have a good sense of humor. But I think Dylan is very much known in his work for having a kind of snarky sense of humor, a kind of absurdist sense of humor that very much separates him from the common, very self-serious artist of that time. And I think that again, parallels Nietzsche, where Nietzsche, especially in the realm of philosophers, was having a lot more fun, I guess you could say, being a lot more witty. Maybe that's not a big connection, but I think it just adds to a lot of the connections that I think you can see being made here. The other thing is that, and again, this sort of goes in line with everything we've been talking about, but Dylan, just as a cultural figure, is very much a rejection of the common societal, structure of the time. And obviously that goes as far as him as a political figure, someone who was very much disrupting these traditionalist lines of thought and values in society. But I think that it even goes to sort of him as a figure who rejected a sort of typical morality and did whatever the hell he wanted to do, right? I guess the famous example of that is just him going electric, and obviously received a lot of outrage about this. He did not care, I think Dylan's entire 60s career was just him doing whatever the hell he wanted to do and not really caring about what anyone else thought at all. And more than that, pushing the sort of moral bounds of things as well. And in that sense, I guess it's just that you certainly can't argue that Dylan was a super great guy. He had a lot of his own problems, which is very clear in all that we know about him from that time. Obviously, Dylan continued to live and make music after the 1960s. And in fact, the main, I guess, rift you could see between Dylan and Nietzsche is that Nietzsche is very vehemently against Christianity, whereas Dylan actually leaned into Christianity, leaned into sort of these more traditionalist values later in his life. The thing about this is that I still feel like he remains very Nietzschean in his early career, but that doesn't mean that there aren't Nietzschean elements to his work in his later career. One of the songs I would go to is I Contain Multitudes from Rough and Rowdy Ways. One of the lines in this song, I mean, obviously there's just the title of the song, but I'll just read you the line where he says, quote, I go right to the edge, I go right to the end. I go where all things are lost and made good again. I sing the songs of experience like William Blake. I have no apologies to make. What I like about this is that, along with the abstract sort of elements about it, the sort of, I go where all things are lost and made good again, which is very interesting. I love how he's leaning into this embrace of experience. He sings the songs of experience, and that he has no apologies to make, which is another kind of rejection of morality, you could say. Because I'm sure Bob Dylan does have regrets, but he's saying he has no apologies to make. He, went his path. He walked his road. And again, the experience thing is very in line with Nietzsche in general, and just sort of this rejection of just being in your head, thinking all the time, and actually living, experiencing the world. That's very important for Nietzsche as a philosopher. And so the other thing about Dylan is, of course he changed later in his career, and he actually changed throughout his entire career. I think that's another very essential thing about Bob Dylan and his work, is that you can't pin him down at all. He was always evolving himself, always moving into different territories, exploring different ideas, becoming completely different people, right? And embracing the change, embracing that multiplicity of life in the same way where he says, I contain multitudes, right? I think that's very in line with Nietzsche, who rejected this sort of one eternal subject ego kind of headspace where we are just this constant thing and life is just this constant, consistent thing. I think that, again, that's very much the way that Dylan presented his career is very much in line with the way of living life that Nietzsche would advocate for, I guess you could say. And I'll specifically just read a quote by Nietzsche, where he says, quote, whatever exists, having somehow come into being, is again and again reinterpreted to new ends, taken over, transformed, and redirected by some power superior to it. All events in the organic world are a subduing, a becoming master, and all subduing and becoming master involves a fresh interpretation, an adaptation through which any previous meaning and purpose are necessarily obscured or even obliterated, right? I love that. I think that applies very much to Bob Dylan and his work. It's constantly being reinterpreted. It's constantly being understood in different lights. And I think that's what makes Bob Dylan such a timeless figure. And so, anyways, that's my kind of, this came out a little more rambly than I hoped that it would come out. I hope you stayed with me. I hope you kind of get the point that I'm trying to make here. I think that Bob Dylan, as a cultural figure, as a writer, as an artist, is very in line with a lot of Nietzschean existentialist kind of views on life and on art. And I thought that that's very fascinating and interesting. If you have any more examples of this, I would love to hear them, because I'm sure that I didn't touch on everything that Bob Dylan or Nietzsche ever said and things that you can connect with that. So, like, I'm sure I could make, if I really wanted to do my research, I'm sure I could make like an hour, 2-hour long video on this, but I'm not going to do that. I just sort of wanted to present what I had been thinking about with it. because it's very interesting to me and intersects two of my big interests. So anyways, that'll do it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one.